She was used to bleeding in silence, until the night the city's most dangerous man saw the wounds the world chose to ignore. Victor Grayson, the perfect mask, behind closed doors and endless nightmare, thought he possessed Alara Vale forever. But that night, a champagne glass shattered on the marble floor, and Roman Moretti, the most feared mob boss on the East Coast, began to take notice. Not of the glass, not of the dress, but of the bruises hidden beneath her sleeve. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't miss out, because from here, things will never be the same again. The champagne flute didn't shatter so much as explode. 1 second it was in Alara Vale's hand, fingers slick from the condensation, and the next it was across the marble floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel's 42nd floor ballroom, crystal fragments catching the light from a dozen chandeliers overhead. And the sound of it, that single sharp crack, cut through 500 conversations at once like a pistol shot. The room didn't go completely silent. Rooms with 500 people and an 11-piece orchestra never go completely silent. But there was a ripple, a collective pause, heads turning, eyes finding the source of the disturbance, and Alara felt every single one of those gazes land on her like a physical weight. She was already kneeling before she'd made a conscious decision to move. "I'm so sorry," she said. She said it to the floor, she said it to the shards of glass. She said it to nobody in particular and everybody at once, which was something she'd gotten very good at over the past 2 years. "I'm so sorry, I'll get this cleaned up. I'm so..." Her fingers were working through the fragments before she registered the pain. A sharp sting across her index finger, then her palm, and when she pulled her hand back there was blood, dark and immediate against the pale of her skin. She pressed it against her dress without thinking, a reflex. Don't make it worse, don't draw more attention, minimize. "Miss?" A server materialized beside her, young man with alarmed eyes, crouching down. "Please, let me..." "You don't have to..." "No, I've got it." She was already reaching for the larger pieces. "It's fine. I've got it." The server's hand covered hers and gently, firmly, stopped her. "Miss, you're bleeding." Alara looked at her hand. She looked at the blood. She had the strange, dissociated thought that she'd seen worse, and that somewhere in the last 2 years that thought had stopped horrifying her, and that maybe that was the most frightening thing of all. "It's nothing," she said. She stood. She smoothed the front of her gown. Deep green, Vera Wang, borrowed beauty for a performance she was increasingly too tired to maintain. She found a cocktail napkin on a passing tray and wrapped it around her fingers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd had a lot of practice at exactly this. Across the ballroom, Victor was watching her. His expression was pleasant. His jaw was tight. Those were not contradictory things in Victor Grayson's face. Alara had learned to read the geography of it the way you learn the terrain of a dangerous road, where the drop-offs were, where the ice formed, where it was safest to slow down and where, no matter what you did, you were going to lose control. She kept her chin up, kept her breathing even, walked back toward him across 40 feet of marble that felt like 40 miles. "Clumsy?" he said when she reached him. Just that. One word, delivered quietly into the air between them, with a smile still on his face, still directed out at the room so that anyone watching would see a man making a private joke with his fiancée. "I'm sorry," she said. "You said that." His hand found the small of her back and pressed, just slightly harder than necessary. "Let's try not to make the evening about you." She nodded. She turned back toward the room. She smiled. This was the Meridian Grand Charity Gala, the 14th annual Benefiting Children's Hospital Network of the Northeast, attended by the city's wealthiest and most influential, photographed for 3 separate society publications. And Alara Vale had been attending it on Victor Grayson's arm for 2 consecutive years as his fiancée, which meant she had spent 2 consecutive years standing in this room, or rooms like it, wearing borrowed beauty and maintained smiles, bleeding quietly into napkins and calling it fine. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 2 of them learning to make herself very, very small. Roman Moretti had been watching since before the glass broke. He was standing near the east end of the bar with Marcus Reyes, his head of operations, nominally listening to Marcus detail a complication in their New Jersey logistics chain. Nominally. In practice, his attention had drifted twice in the last 10 minutes, both times to the same place. The green dress, the dark hair, the woman who kept finding ways to take up less space in a room that was supposed to be a celebration. He'd seen her before, 3 times, at events like this, always at Grayson's side, always with that same quality of careful stillness that his mother used to call the quiet that comes before impact. Roman had grown up around enough violence to recognize its proximity in the behavior of people who'd learned to anticipate it. He was 41 years old. He ran 4 legitimate businesses and several that existed in murkier waters, employed 300 people directly, and influenced the livelihoods of twice that many more. Had been feared or respected, usually both, since he was 27. He did not make impulsive decisions. He did not involve himself in situations that were not his business. He watched her kneel to the floor and gather broken glass with her bare hands. He watched her apologize to the fragments. He watched her wrap her bleeding fingers in a cocktail napkin and stand up and walk back to Victor Grayson and hold herself like a woman waiting for a verdict. When Grayson's hand went to her back, Roman set down his glass. "Finish that thought later," he said to Marcus. "I was in the middle of later." He moved through the room without urgency. This was a skill, appearing unhurried. The truth was that Roman Moretti moved through every room in his life with a current running through him, something kinetic and contained, and it had taken him years to learn how not to let other people feel it. He stopped twice, once to exchange 3 sentences with Senator Paulson, once to accept a handshake from Daniel Whitmore, the hospital network's board chair, who was the nominal reason all 500 people were here tonight. By the time he reached Grayson's orbit, he had composed himself into something casual. Victor Grayson was 44, dark-haired, patrician, with the jaw and posture of a man who'd been told his whole life that he looked exactly like what power was supposed to look like. He ran Grayson Capital Partners, which managed $9 billion in private equity, and he sat on the boards of 2 banks and a healthcare conglomerate, and he donated to both parties with careful, calculated distribution, which meant he had friends in every corner of this room and enemies nowhere he could see them. "Moretti," Grayson extended a hand. "Didn't expect to see you tonight. I try to make it every year." Roman shook the hand, firm, clean. He turned to the woman beside Grayson and kept his expression easy. "Roman Moretti, Alara Vale." Her hand was cool when he took it. The cocktail napkin was gone. She'd disposed of it somewhere in transit. The cut on her index finger had been pressed into a thin white line against her palm. "I think I've seen you at the Caldwell Foundation dinner in March," Roman said, "and the Harbor benefit last November." Something passed through her eyes. Surprise, maybe, at being noticed or remembered. "That's right." "You're engaged," Roman said to Grayson. "I hadn't heard an announcement." "We're keeping it quiet for now." Grayson's arm moved around Alara's shoulders. Possessive. The kind of touch that looked like affection to people who weren't watching for the distinction. "Family matters." "Of course." Roman held Alara's gaze for 1 moment longer than courtesy required, just long enough to see her look away, and something settled in his chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Congratulations." He moved on. Over the next 2 hours he did not speak to her again, but he watched, with the systematic patience of a man who had built an empire on the discipline of seeing things whole rather than in pieces. He watched the way she tracked Victor's position in the room without appearing to look. He watched the way her body language shifted, subtly, barely perceptibly, but shifted, every time Victor moved toward her, a kind of preemptive recalibration, adjusting to anticipated pressure. He watched the way she laughed at things that were not funny, at precisely the right frequency, and how her eyes during those laughs remained perfectly, carefully blank. He watched the sleeve of her gown slide 2 inches up her forearm when she reached for a glass and he saw the edge of something there. Faded yellow-green against her inner arm, the last days of a bruise, before the fabric settled back. He stood very still for a moment after that. Then he found Marcus and told him to pull everything public record on Victor Grayson and to start looking for things that weren't public record. Marcus, who had worked with Roman for 14 years, asked no questions. He simply nodded and made a call. Roman drove home at 11:30. His penthouse was 42 floors above the city, and from his office window, Manhattan looked like something ordered and beautiful and completely legible, every light in its place, every structure serving a comprehensible function. He poured 2 fingers of scotch and did not drink it. He thought about the bruise. He thought about the glass. He thought about a 26-year-old woman who apologized to the floor. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself he was not equipped to be anyone's intervention. He told himself that he had seen worse, much worse, and that you could not save people from the choices they hadn't yet made for themselves. He told himself all of this with considerable conviction, and he believed approximately none of it. The first report from Marcus arrived 3 days later. Roman read it at 6 in the morning at his kitchen table with his first coffee of the day. It was 16 pages. He read it twice. By the time he reached the last page, he had set down the coffee and was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table. Victor Grayson had been formally investigated twice in 12 years, once for securities manipulation, once for workplace harassment, and both investigations had been quietly closed before charges were filed. The harassment case had involved 3 separate female employees. The documentation that Marcus's source had accessed showed a pattern of behavior that had been deemed insufficiently provable and expediently forgotten. Alara Vale came from the Vale family, Boston old money now considerably diminished. Her father, Franklin Vale, had made 2 bad decisions. First, to invest heavily in a Grayson capital fund that had performed catastrophically, and second, to borrow against future returns that never came. The resulting debt, restructured through a series of private agreements that Marcus's people were still untangling, put Franklin Vale in a position of considerable dependence on Victor Grayson's goodwill. The engagement had been announced 14 months ago. Alara had had 1 prior relationship of note. A photographer named Sam Cho, 3 years together, ended 8 months before the engagement announcement. Roman's people found Sam Cho in Brooklyn now, running a small studio. They did not contact him. They noted his existence and moved on. There were no police reports, no emergency room records in New York, though there was a visit to a private physician 6 months ago for a wrist injury described as accidental. Roman sat with that word, accidental, and turned it over in his mind the way you'd handle something you suspected of being other than what it appeared. He closed the folder. He thought about what he was doing, not what he'd done. The investigation was done, the information was in front of him. He thought about what came next, which was a different kind of question. Roman had learned early that information was not the same as obligation. Knowing something did not require you to act on it. Action had consequences that spread out in ways you couldn't always anticipate, and he had been burned before years ago by the belief that he could fix things that were not his to fix. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Find out his schedule," he said, "and hers. I want to know where they are and when." He hung up before Marcus could ask why. The second time he saw her was a week later, at a smaller event, a private auction for the Harwick Museum of Contemporary Art. 80 people, a converted industrial space in Chelsea, enough wine and clever lighting to make the industrial space feel intentional. Victor Grayson was a museum board member. He arrived with Alara at 8:15, 20 minutes after Roman. Roman watched from a calculated distance. The bruise on her arm was gone. There was something new instead, barely visible, the collar of her dress concealing most of it, but she turned her head at one point and he caught a moment of it, a line of discoloration across the right side of her jaw where foundation had been applied with precision but not quite precision enough. His jaw tightened. He made himself look somewhere else. She was talking to a collector named Patricia Wayne, who was 70-something and wore her gray hair cropped and her opinions unsoftened, and Alara was listening to her with genuine attention, which was different from the performance he'd seen at the gala. For a few minutes, the careful blankness dropped, and there was something underneath it. Intelligence, curiosity, the kind of focused engagement that came from a person who actually cared about what someone else was saying. Roman found himself watching that, the real version of her underneath the managed one, with something he didn't immediately categorize and didn't try to. Victor appeared at her elbow at 8:47. Roman noted the time from reflex. The real version of her disappeared immediately. It was the speed of it that got him. Not gradual, not a shift. Instantaneous, like a door shutting. Whatever she'd been a moment before, she packed it up and put it somewhere else without hesitation, without visibly doing so, and became the fiancé again. The acceptable surface version, the one that apologized for broken glass. Roman crossed the room, not toward her, toward the exit corridor, which happened to take him within 6 feet of where they stood. He did not look directly at them as he passed. He caught the end of something in Victor's voice, pitched low, private, carrying the specific texture of displeasure wrapped in social pleasantness. Told you about talking to Patricia Wayne. She runs to that journalist at the... I know, Ilara said. I know, you just... A pause. We'll talk about this later. Roman kept walking. He found a quiet corner near the auction lots and stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets and concentrated on the thing his father used to tell him when he was 17 and already prone to violence. You cannot fix everything by breaking it first. There are situations that require patience. Wait. Watch. Understand the whole shape of it before you move. His father had been a patient man. Roman was a patient man. He had learned it the hard way, the same way you learn most things of value. But there was something happening in his chest that patience didn't fully address. He stayed until 10. He said the things that required saying to the people who required saying them to. He bid on a piece he didn't particularly want and let himself be outbid on purpose by a collector from Chicago who'd driven 4 hours for it. On his way out, he passed Ilara again, alone for a moment by the coat check. Their eyes met. She looked away first, quickly, reflexively. Then, and he noticed this, filed it, she looked back. He stopped. Ms. Vale? Mr. Moretti. She kept her voice neutral, pleasant, appropriate. Are you leaving? I am. He held her gaze. Are you all right? A pause. It was a small pause, the kind that most people would miss, but Roman was not most people, and he did not miss the way her composure flickered for just a fragment of a second. Something behind her eyes that wasn't the managed version. Something that looked almost like the question meant something. Before she smiled and said, Of course. Lovely evening. It was, he said. He left. He sat in his car for 6 minutes before telling his driver to go. The third encounter was 11 days later, and it was the one that changed everything, though Roman would not have been able to say afterward exactly when he crossed from watching to deciding. Maybe it was before the fundraiser even began. Maybe the decision had already been made that morning in his kitchen with the first report and the cold coffee and his hands flat on the table. The Whitmore Foundation dinner was a formal affair, the kind that required black tie and a certain willingness to perform wealth at each other for the duration of a 6-course meal. Roman had been seated at a table with 2 senators, a tech billionaire who kept trying to discuss cryptocurrency, and a film producer whose third wife was 23 years younger than him and clearly somewhere between miserable and furious about the seating arrangement. Ilara was 3 tables away. He watched her work through the meal with the competence of someone who had spent years learning the performance. She was gracious, attentive, appropriately engaged. She laughed at the right moments. She touched Victor's arm twice in ways that looked like affection and were not. Victor drank. This was the variable Roman had been noting for weeks in the data Marcus compiled on Grayson's routines and behaviors. Victor Grayson was a controlled drinker in public, 2 drinks maximum at most events, maintaining the facade with the discipline of a man who knew the facade was load-bearing. But tonight, something was different. He was on his 4th glass of wine by the main course, and Roman, watched the tightening around Grayson's eyes that came with drink, the way the pleasantness started requiring more effort to maintain. A disagreement happened near the end of the meal. Roman didn't hear it. Too much distance, too much ambient noise. But he saw it, the way Grayson turned to Ilara with something sharp in his expression, the way she went very still, the way she said something brief and careful, and how it wasn't careful enough. Because Victor's hand went to the table with a sound that made the people at their table look up and then look away. Roman set down his fork. He watched Ilara excuse herself from the table. He waited 90 seconds, finished his water, excused himself to no one in particular, and went to find her. The service corridor ran behind the main ballroom, accessible through an unmarked door near the dessert station. He'd noted the door earlier, the way he noted exits and access points everywhere he went, automatic and constant, the architecture of his own psychology. He pushed through it, and the ambient noise of the dinner dropped, and he was in a low-lit utility hallway that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and old stone, and Alara Vale was standing with her back against the wall 6 feet in, and her lip was bleeding. She was not crying. That was the first thing he registered, and somehow it was worse than if she had been. The absence of it, the careful control, the way she was pressing 2 fingers to her lower lip with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before, who knew from experience how long it took, how much pressure was required, how to assess whether it would need more than this. Her right wrist was cradled against her body. It was swollen visibly. There was blood on her right hand from something else, knuckles and palm, the kind of damage that came from a hard surface rather than a blade, and he reconstructed it in a second. She'd put her hand up, she'd hit something on the way down or been shoved into it, glass maybe. The cabinet he'd noticed near their table had a glass front. She looked at him when he came in. She didn't look afraid of him specifically, which told him something. She looked like a woman who had so thoroughly calibrated her fear to one particular source that other threats had become secondary. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than most people's would be in the condition she was in. There was a glass cabinet. I'll pay for—" Roman stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her. Not at the blood, not at the swollen wrist, not at the carefully maintained composure over all of it. He looked at the fact that those were the first words out of her mouth. He looked at the fact that she believed the broken glass was the thing that required addressing. He had been a patient man. He had watched. He had waited. He had told himself a dozen times that this was not his situation to enter, that he did not know her well enough, that intervention without invitation was its own kind of violence. He looked at her standing in a utility corridor with a split lip and a damaged wrist, apologizing for a glass cabinet. Something in Roman Moretti's chest cracked open along a fault line he hadn't known was there. "Stop," he said. She blinked. "Don't." His voice came out low and very even. "Don't apologize for the glass." A silence. She took her fingers from her lip. The bleeding had slowed to almost nothing. She looked at him with those careful eyes, and he could see her recalibrating, trying to read this new variable, trying to determine where the danger was coming from now. "Mr. Moretti." "Roman." Another silence. Longer. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not." "I can manage." "I know you can." He said it quietly. "That's not the point." She looked at him for a long moment. He watched something move through her expression. Not hope, exactly, because hope was something that required a certain amount of safety to survive. And safety was not a thing she'd had in long enough supply to maintain it. It was something more fragile than hope. It was the moment before hope. The moment when a person is deciding whether allowing themselves to hope is worth the risk of being wrong. "You don't know what you're getting involved in," she said finally. "No," Roman agreed, "but I'm going to." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Plain white, a number, nothing else. He held it out. She looked at it for a long time before she took it. "There will be consequences," he said, "for what happened tonight." The way her face changed, just slightly, just the tightening around the eyes, told him she'd heard that word before in that context, that her immediate interpretation was aimed inward, at herself, the way every threatening thing in her world had been aimed inward for 2 years. "Not for you," he said. And he left her in the corridor with the card in her bleeding hand, and walked back into the dinner, and finished his dessert, and made his excuses at 10:15, and sat in the back of his car with his phone in his hand and called Marcus. "Grayson," he said, "I want everything, every account, every liability, every person he's compromised and everyone who's compromised him. I want it in my hands by Monday." "That's 4 days," Marcus said. "Then start tonight." He hung up. The city moved past the window. 42 stories above it, his penthouse waited, and the scotch he'd poured 3 weeks ago and never drunk, and the 16-page report he'd already memorized. Roman Moretti looked out at the dark water of the Hudson and made a decision he could not take back. Alara Vale did not know it yet. Victor Grayson did not know it yet. But something had ended tonight in that utility corridor, and something else had begun. And Roman, who had spent 20 years understanding the precise and irreversible nature of beginnings, felt it settle into him the way certainty always did. Not loudly, not with drama, but with the quiet, absolute weight of a door swinging shut. He did not know yet what it would cost him. He did not know yet what it would cost her. He only knew that the woman who apologized for broken glass was standing in a corridor with his number in her hand, and that Victor Grayson had used up whatever margin of safety the city's unspoken rules had once afforded him. The question now was whether Ilara would make the call before Victor escalated again. And Roman, watching the city, feared very much that she wouldn't, that the same survival instincts that had kept her functional for 2 years would now work against her, telling her to endure, to minimize, to manage, to wait. And that waiting was exactly what Victor Grayson was counting on. His phone sat quiet in his hand. He watched the river. He waited for it to ring. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The card sat in her nightstand drawer for 6 days. Ilara knew exactly where it was at every moment, the way you always know where the thing is that you're trying not to think about. She'd placed it under the spare phone charger in a tube of hand cream, which was a deliberate choice, buried but not gone, accessible but requiring effort, close enough to remind her it existed and hidden enough that she could pretend she hadn't decided anything yet. She hadn't decided anything yet. That was what she told herself. On the second day, Victor asked her about the Whitmore dinner. Not directly. He was never direct about these things afterward, never named them, as if the naming would require him to acknowledge what the thing was. He asked her instead why she'd been so quiet on the drive home, whether something was wrong, whether she was feeling all right. His voice was warm and concerned, and she stood in their kitchen and watched him pour his morning coffee with steady hands and a pleasant expression and said she was fine, just tired, and he nodded and kissed her forehead and left for the office. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after he was gone. Her wrists still ached. She'd wrapped it herself that night, tight and functional, and told herself it was a sprain, not a fracture, because a fracture meant a doctor and a doctor meant questions. She was very good at the arithmetic of what required medical attention and what could be managed alone. On the 4th day, she ran into Marcus Reyes. She didn't know who he was at the time. She was coming out of a coffee shop on 53rd Street at 8 in the morning, travel cup in hand, and a man fell into step beside her for exactly half a block. Mid-40s, compact, dark jacket, the kind of face that was specifically unremarkable, and said quietly, without looking at her, "Mr. Moretti wanted you to know the offer stands. No pressure, no timeline." And then he turned at the corner and was gone. Ilara stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her coffee and her heart rate, and the specific feeling of a world rearranging itself around a new variable. She walked the rest of the way to the office with her head down and her hand wrapped around the warm cup and tried to decide if she was afraid. She probed at it the way you'd test a bruised rib, carefully, methodically, expecting pain. What she found instead was something quieter, stranger. She found herself wondering for the first time in a long time what it would feel like to let someone else carry something for a while. She got to her desk. She opened her email. She did not call Roman Moretti, not that day. On the 6th day, Victor found a text message on her phone from a law firm, Kellerman and Associates, family law. A confirmation of an appointment she'd made and then rescheduled twice and then finally made again. She'd been careful. She'd thought she'd been careful. She hadn't been careful enough. She was in the bathroom when she heard him stop moving in the other room. She knew that particular silence, the quality of it, the weight. She'd become a connoisseur of silences in 2 years. The safe ones, the uncertain ones, the ones that preceded things she couldn't take back. This one landed in her chest like a stone. She came out of the bathroom. He was standing in the middle of the bedroom with her phone in his hand. His face was still. This was worse than the other kind, Bets, the explosive kind she'd also learned, the one that announced itself. The still kind had no announcement. It just arrived. "Who is Kellerman?" he said. Not a question, not exactly. "A law firm," she said. "I know what it is." He set the phone down on the dresser with controlled deliberateness. "What I'm asking is why you have a confirmed appointment with a family law firm at 2 o'clock on Tuesday." Ilara stood in the doorway of the bathroom and felt the floor under her feet and reminded herself to breathe. "I was just getting some information. I wasn't... information." He said the word the way you'd say something you'd found under a piece of furniture, distasteful, unwelcome. What kind of information? About the engagement structure, the family agreements. I just wanted to understand what are our. He turned toward her. Since when do you use the word our when you mean my? Since when are you independently consulting attorneys about agreements that exist because your father couldn't manage basic financial obligations? There it was. The debt. He always came back to the debt, the way you come back to a wound you're not sure is healed, pressing it, testing it, keeping it open. She felt her jaw tighten. I have a right to understand my legal situation, she said. She kept her voice level. She was proud of how level it was. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stopped close to her. Not touching, not yet, just close. The specific geography of intimidation, taking up the space until there was none left for her. You have a right, he said softly, to exactly what we've agreed to. That's it. That's the full extent of your rights in this situation, Ilara. Do you understand me? She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, and in the looking, she became aware of something happening that hadn't happened before, say, a shift, small but tectonic, in the internal architecture of how she faced him. Something had moved. Something that used to be reflexively afraid was now, underneath the fear, also something else, something harder. I understand you, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back. He picked up his jacket from the chair. Cancel the appointment, he said. Tell them a conflict came up. He left for the office. She stood in the bedroom and listened to the front door close and stood there a while longer after that, very still, her hand moving to her pocket before she consciously directed it there, fingers finding the edge of the card she'd moved from the nightstand to her jacket pocket that morning, without entirely understanding why. She looked at the number. She looked at the window, at the city, at the ordinary Tuesday morning beyond the glass. She called. Roman answered on the second ring. Ms. Vale. She hadn't prepared anything to say. She stood there for a moment with the phone to her ear, and the bedroom around her and the whole unsayable weight of 2 years pressing against her sternum, and she said the only true thing she could manage. I don't know what I'm asking for. A pause. When he spoke, his voice was even. No urgency, no performance, just steady. You don't have to know. Tell me where you are. They met an hour later in a coffee shop in Midtown, generic, crowded, the kind of place where nobody was paying attention to anyone else, because everyone was already having their own difficult morning. Roman arrived before her and had positioned himself in a corner booth with sightlines to both entrances, which she noticed and understood and found unexpectedly reassuring. He was in a gray suit with no tie, which was less formal than she'd seen him before, and he stood when she came in, which Victor never did. And she sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around a coffee cup and looked at the table. He found the appointment, she said. Roman said nothing. He let her have the silence. With the law firm. I was trying to understand the family agreements, the debt restructuring, whether there was anything in the original terms that I could... She stopped, pressed her lips together. He told me to cancel it. Did you? Not yet. Roman nodded. Okay. That's it? Okay. What would you like me to say? She looked up at him then. It was the first time she'd looked directly at him since she'd sat down, and she found the same thing she'd found in the corridor at the Whitmore dinner. A quality of stillness, of complete and patient attention that was different from any attention she'd been paid in a long time. Most people looked at her and saw Victor's fiancée, or Franklin Vale's daughter, or the woman in the green dress who apologized for the broken glass. Roman looked at her like he was simply looking at her, which was a stranger and more complicated experience than she would have expected. He's going to escalate, she said. When he realizes I haven't canceled, he's going to... I know. You don't know him. I know enough. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer, a precise, deliberate movement. Marcus gave me the financial structure. Your father's debt, the original investment, the restructuring. It's been transferred twice through intermediary entities since it was first recorded. The current holder isn't Grayson Capital Partners. She frowned. What? It's held by a private vehicle that Grayson controls personally. which means it's not regulated by the same disclosure requirements as the fund, which means the terms he's enforcing against your family may not be legally valid under the agreements they actually signed. The air in the coffee shop continued being the air in the coffee shop. The sounds continued. Alara sat very still with this information and tried to understand its shape. "He's been lying to us," she said. "He's been allowing you to believe you had no options. That's not the same as lying, technically, but it's the same effect. Your father thinks he owes Grayson a debt that Grayson actually sold off to himself through a different entity 3 years ago. The lawyers at Kellerman can confirm it, but you'd need to keep that appointment." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" The question sat between them. Roman looked back at her. "Because someone should," he said. It was not a satisfying answer. It was also, she realized, the most honest one he could have given her, because it didn't pretend to be more than what it was, and she had been surrounded for 2 years by pretending. She kept the appointment. Tuesday came with overcast skies and the particular New York chill of early spring that never commits to being cold but makes you feel it anyway. She told Victor she had a lunch with a colleague from the Vale family's former charitable foundation. A plausible cover, uncheckable in the short term. She dressed carefully because she dressed carefully for everything now, and she took a cab that she paid for in cash, and she sat in the offices of Kellerman and Associates for 90 minutes with a senior partner named Helen Chu, who had 20 years of family law experience and a way of delivering difficult information that was calm and direct and treated Alara like an adult. The financial picture, as Helen Chu laid it out, was worse than what Roman had described and better than what Alara had feared, which is to say, it was complicated in ways that were survivable rather than ways that were catastrophic. The debt vehicle was legally murky. There were questions about the original transfer. There might be grounds, not certainly, to challenge the enforceability of the agreement against her father. How long would a challenge take, Alara asked. Realistically, months, possibly longer. And during that time, if Grayson decides to accelerate or call the debt, then yes, your father's position becomes precarious until a court weighs in. Helen Chu looked at her steadily. "Ms. Vale, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to know you can answer directly." "All right. Is there anything else we should know about this situation? Anything that might be relevant to your decision-making process about how quickly you need to move?" Alara sat with the question. She thought about the corridor at the Whitmore dinner. She thought about the bathroom at the charity gala, and the service exit at the art auction, and the bedroom that morning 6 days ago, and the specific texture of her own wrist against her palm when she wrapped it herself in the middle of the night. "Yes," she said. Helen Chu nodded. She turned a page in her notepad. "Tell me." Victor called at 3:47. She was in a cab heading back uptown. She saw his name on the screen and felt her stomach drop through the seat and answered it anyway. "Where are you?" Not a question. Never a question. "Just leaving lunch. I'm on my way." "You lied to me." The cab moved through traffic. She kept her voice flat. "I don't know what you... Patricia Wayne saw you going into a building on 47th Street at 12:30. She called to ask me what the issue with Kellerman was, whether there was a family matter she should know about." A pause. "So I'll ask you again, where were you?" Alara closed her eyes, opened them. "At a legal consultation." The silence on the other end was the worst kind, the contained kind, the kind that meant he was somewhere he couldn't respond the way he wanted to, and so he was compressing it all down until there was somewhere he could. "Come home," he said. She thought about the corridor, the card, Roman's voice on the phone. "You don't have to know. Tell me where you are." "I'll be home by 6, she said. "Now, Alara." "By 6, she said, and hung up before she could stop herself, which she had never done, not once in 2 years, and her hands were shaking, but they were shaking, and she had still done it, and the cab moved uptown through the gray afternoon, and she stared at the driver's head and breathed in and breathed out, and made herself sit with what she'd just done. She didn't go home. She called Roman. He answered in one ring this time. "He knows," she said. A beat, then, "Where are you?" "In a cab, uptown. Don't go home." His voice was controlled, but something under it had sharpened. "Do you hear me? Don't go back to that apartment tonight. My things? Things can be replaced. My father, if Victor calls him, I'll handle that. Elara. He said her name with a particular precision, like he was planting it somewhere solid for her to stand on. Listen to me. You did the right thing today. Don't undo it. She sat in the moving cab and pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window and thought, this is the edge. This is the actual edge. Because she understood, with the clarity that fear sometimes produces, that she had crossed a line today that Victor would not be able to walk her back from. She had gone to the lawyer, she had been seen, she had hung up on him. And she understood Victor Grayson well enough after 2 years to know that these were not things he absorbed and moved past. These were things that compounded, that built, that demanded resolution on his terms. If she went home tonight, whatever resolution he'd built up over the last 4 hours was going to require somewhere to go. Where do I go? She asked. Roman told her. The building was a residential tower in the 60s, the kind of place that employed 3 doormen and asked no questions of people it had been told to expect. A woman named Clara met her in the lobby, 40s, efficient, not unkind, and took her to a furnished apartment on the 19th floor that looked like it had been recently prepared for occupation. Fresh towels, fully stocked kitchen, nothing personal but everything functional. He keeps several for situations, Clara said, which was the most she said about the situation. Elara stood in the living room with her bag and her phone and the specific disorientation of a person who has just made a decision they cannot unmake and is standing on the other side of it for the first time. Her phone showed 11 missed calls from Victor, 2 from her father. She called her father. He answered on the first ring, which meant Victor had already reached him. Her father's voice was tight and quiet and frightened in the specific way that men who cannot admit to fear sound when they're afraid. Elara, Victor called. He says there's been some confusion about... Dad, she sat down on the couch. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. He listened, mostly. He interrupted twice, both times with the practical objection, the debt, the money, the exposure, and she let him interrupt and said, both times, I know, let me finish. When she was done, there was a long quiet on the line. The debt vehicle, her father said, the transfer to the private entity. Kellerman is looking into it. If that's true, it's true. Another silence. Then, slowly, something that might have been the beginning of anger, not at her, which was new. He told me the restructuring was standard. He told me, I know what he told you. Her father made a sound she hadn't heard from him in years, something tired and ashamed and working its way slowly towards something harder. What do you need? He said. She looked at the unfamiliar room, the efficient furniture, the view of a city that continued regardless. Right now, she said, I just need you not to call him back. I won't, her father said. She sat for a long time after the call. She didn't eat, though the kitchen had food. She didn't sleep, though the bed was made. She sat and watched the city go dark outside the window and thought about what came next, which was a vast and uncertain territory she'd been too afraid to approach for 2 years. Her phone showed new messages from Victor at 9 and 10 and 11. She read none of them. At 11:45, it rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. It's Marcus, said the voice. Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you he's aware of some movement. Grayson made calls tonight to 2 of the families involved in the original investment structure and to someone in the city's regulatory office. We don't know yet what he's putting in place, but he's putting something in place. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. Cold. Solid. Real. What does that mean? She asked. It means, Marcus said carefully, that he's not going to let this resolve quietly. He's going to make it cost something. She stood at the window for a long time after that call ended. The city spread below her, indifferent and vast, full of its own 10,000 emergencies that had nothing to do with hers. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about her father's voice, the ashamed and slowly hardening thing in it. She thought about Helen Chu's notepad and the things she'd said to it. She thought about Roman Moretti sitting across from her in a generic midtown coffee shop saying, because someone should. She was still standing at the window when her phone buzzed. Victor's name. And this time, beneath the fear that still lived in her, immovable and real, there was the other thing, the new thing, the thing she was still learning the shape of. And she looked at his name on the screen and she did not answer, and she did not apologize, and she stood in her borrowed room in her borrowed city and understood, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that Victor Grayson had just realized she had finally stopped being afraid of losing her. That realization landed in her chest at midnight and didn't leave. She slept badly. The borrowed apartment had blackout curtains and a mattress that was better than anything in the apartment she shared with Victor, which was a specific kind of irony she turned over in her mind at 3 a.m. while the city hummed its indifferent hum outside. She slept in increments, 40 minutes, 20, an hour. And each time she surfaced, she had a half second of not knowing where she was, followed by the full weight of knowing, and neither sensation was entirely bearable. By 6, she was up. She made coffee in the functional kitchen and stood at the window and watched the city go from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of early morning, and she thought about her father, and she thought about what Marcus had said, and she thought about the word movement, which could mean a lot of things, and none of them were comforting. Roman called at 7:15. "How are you?" he said. Not a pleasantry. An actual question. Tired. She wrapped her free hand around her coffee. What did he do? A pause. She had learned already that Roman's pauses were not evasions. They were calibrations. The brief interval between knowing something and deciding how to say it. He called in a favor from someone at the city's business licensing board, Roman said. There's a flag now on a permit renewal for one of your father's remaining properties. Commercial lease, Beacon Street building in Boston. The renewal was routine. Now it's under review. Alara set down the coffee. That's his message, she said. Yes. He can't take the whole building over a permit review. No. But he can make it expensive and slow and uncertain, and he knows your father doesn't have the capital to absorb a prolonged legal battle over a permit while simultaneously dealing with the debt questions Kellerman raised. It's not a killing blow, it's a pressure point. She stood very still. She understood the geometry of it with cold, clear precision. Victor was not going to come at her directly. Not yet, because coming at her directly required acknowledging that she had done something that warranted a direct response. And Victor Grayson's entire self-conception required him to be the reasonable party. Instead, he was going to press on everything adjacent to her until the pressure became unbearable. He's going to work through my father, she said. That's my read. And my father will ask me to come back. Roman said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She exhaled slowly. What do I do? You let Kellerman do what Kellerman does. Helen Chu is already filing a motion to compel disclosure on the debt transfer documentation. Once that's in front of a judge, Grayson's leverage over your father weakens considerably. How long? Weeks. Maybe a few days if Chu moves fast and the docket cooperates. He's not going to wait weeks, Alara said. No, Roman said. He's not. She thought about that for a moment. Outside the window, a cloud moved across the pale gold sky, and the light changed slightly and then changed back. Roman, she said. Yes. What aren't you telling me? Another pause. Longer. Last night, Grayson made a call I didn't expect, Roman said, to a woman named Diane Foss. She's an investigative journalist with a long record of covering financial crimes and personal misconduct. She broke 3 major stories in the last 8 years, and she has a reputation for... He stopped. Started again. She has a reputation for using her sources in ways that damage the people who come to her, not just the people they're reporting on. Alara frowned. Why would Victor go to a journalist? His whole position depends on his reputation being... He didn't go to her about him, Roman said. He went to her about me. The morning light held still. He knows you're involved, she said. He suspects. He doesn't have confirmation yet, but Foss has been sitting on a story about several of my business interests for 2 years, waiting for a trigger. If Grayson gives her what she needs to connect those interests to the situation, he'll use you against me. He'll try to. Roman's voice was even, controlled. I want you to know this because you deserve to know the full picture, not to change anything, but so you're not surprised. She wasn't surprised. She was something else, something that sat in her sternum like a live wire, hot and unwelcome. She had spent 2 years being the thing Victor used against the people around her, the implied threat, the soft target that made other people compliant, and the idea that it was happening again in a different configuration with a different person who had done nothing but try to help her made her feel something she hadn't felt clearly in a very long time. Rage. Small, specific, and entirely clarifying. All right, she said. Alara, I said all right. She picked up the coffee again. Tell me what I need to do today. She met with Helen Chu at 9. The Kellerman offices were clean and quiet and smelled of good coffee and document storage, and Helen sat across from her with a legal pad and walked her through the filing with the same calm directness as the first meeting, and Alara sat and listened and answered questions and signed what needed signing. She asked, at the end, "What's the most important thing I need to preserve right now?" Helen looked at her. Documentation. Anything you have that establishes a pattern, dates, incidents, any records of the original financial agreements, and witnesses, if you have them. I have some, Alara said. She thought about Patricia Wayne, who had called Victor to ask about Kellerman. She crossed her off the mental list. She thought about other people, other events, the geography of 2 years of social performance, and she identified 3 names, people who had seen things, who she believed were decent enough to be honest, and wrote them on the pad Helen slid across to her. She was in a cab heading back to the apartment at 11 when her father called. She answered. His voice was different from last night. The processing had happened, and what was left was something older and more tired and specifically ashamed. I've been thinking, he said, about what you told me. Dad, let me say this. A breath. I put you in this. I made the investment. I signed the agreements. When Victor came to me about the engagement, I told myself I was giving you an opportunity. I told myself you could make a life with him. I knew his reputation, but I told myself... He stopped. I told myself a lot of things. Alara pressed her forehead against the cab window. Cold glass, same as last night. You didn't know. I should have asked more questions. His voice was rough. He implied when we were first negotiating that you were amenable, that you'd met and there was an interest. I should have asked you directly. I know. I'm asking you now. A pause. What do you need from me? Don't take his calls, she said. Whatever he tells you about the permit, about Kellerman, about any of it, call Helen Chu first before you respond to anything. Can you do that? Yes. And Dad? She closed her eyes. If he tells you I'm in danger or unstable or that this is a misunderstanding, he's going to try that angle. Whatever he says, I'm okay. I need you to believe I'm okay. A long pause. Then her father said something she hadn't heard from him in years, since she was very young, since before the money went and the family got smaller and the world got harder and he got quieter. I believe you. She held the phone to her ear for a moment after the call ended and didn't move. The driver asked if she was getting out. She got out. The twist came on the 3rd day. Not from Victor. Not from the direction she'd been watching. It came from Sam Cho. She didn't know he'd been contacted until Roman called her at 2 in the afternoon with his voice carrying something she hadn't heard in it yet. A flatness, careful and controlled, the particular vocal quality of a man delivering information he would rather not be delivering. Foss reached out to your former partner, he said. Sam Cho, 3 hours ago. Alara went still. She was standing in the middle of the apartment's small living room, and she went completely, carefully still. How do you know? Sam called a mutual contact of ours. He wanted to know what he was stepping into before he responded. What did she want? She told him she was working on a story about financial coercion in high society engagements. She said she'd heard he had information about the circumstances of your engagement, specifically whether it had been arranged under pressure. She asked him to come in and talk. Alara sat down on the couch. Her legs had made the decision before she did. Sam wouldn't... I know. Roman's voice was even. He's not the problem. The problem is what Foss told him on the call. A beat. She told him, Roman continued, that she had documented evidence from a source inside the Kellerman firm confirming that you had recently filed for legal counsel. She said she had correspondence, specific correspondence. The room was silent. Alara said, "There's a source inside Kellerman. Someone gave Grayson access to information from your consultation. Privileged information, client communications." The full shape of it assembled itself in front of her with horrible, mechanical clarity. Victor had someone inside the law firm. He'd known about the appointment before Patricia Wayne saw her on 47th Street. He'd let her think she was operating in secret while he watched every move. And now he had her privileged communications in the hands of a journalist. And whatever she'd said to Helen Chu in that first meeting, whatever she'd said when Helen asked her directly if there was anything else relevant, "He has what I told them," she said. Roman didn't answer, which was answer enough. I told them about the incidents. I gave them dates. I told them—" She stopped. Her hand was pressed flat against her sternum. She could feel her own heartbeat, fast and uneven, which she was usually better at not noticing. If Foss publishes that, Victor will say it's fabricated. He'll call it a manipulation campaign. He has the resources to— Alara. He'll go after my father. He'll call the dead immediately. Alara. Roman's voice cut through clean and steady. "Listen to me." She made herself stop talking. She breathed. "Foss publishing anything requires verification," he said. "She's not going to run a story on privileged legal communications without independent corroboration. That's a liability she won't take. What this is Grayson letting you know he can. It's another pressure point. He wants you to panic and come back. And if I don't? Then he escalates." She laughed, short and without any humor in it. "Of course he does." She stood up. She walked to the window. She was becoming familiar with this window, the specific configuration of rooftops and water towers, and the sliver of the park visible to the northeast. She'd looked at it enough in 3 days to have memorized it. "Who's the source inside Kellerman?" "We're working on it." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." She turned away from the window. Her mind was working the way it sometimes did under sufficient pressure, quickly, coldly, moving through variables with a precision that surprised her because she'd spent so long in the fog of just trying to survive that she'd forgotten she was capable of thinking clearly. "The mutual contact Sam called," she said. "Who is it?" A pause. "Someone I trust." "I need to talk to Sam." "Alara." "He was with me for 3 years. He knows the timeline. He knows what the relationship with Victor looked like from the outside before I understood what it was. If Foss goes to him, I'd rather he have the full picture than a curated version she's feeding him." She kept her voice even. She was watching her own breathing, keeping it slow. "I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. I need to talk to Sam." A long pause. "I'll arrange it," Roman said. She met Sam Cho the next morning in a coffee shop in Brooklyn, which was his territory and which felt right. She was the one intruding on his life, his reasonable life, his photography studio, and his post-her existence, and she could at least give him the geographic advantage. He was the same as she remembered, which was strange and not strange. He'd kept the beard. He looked like someone who was sleeping well and working steadily and had spent the last 3 years building a life that fit him, and she sat across from him and felt the specific weight of everything they'd been to each other, and then not been to each other, and the 2 years between then and now. And she said, "Thank you for coming." "Are you okay?" He said it immediately, before anything else. And she had to look at her coffee cup for a moment before she could answer because the directness of it, the simple, uncomplicated concern, hit her somewhere tender. "I'm getting there," she said. She told him what she could. Not everything, not Roman, not the specific mechanics of what was being put in motion, but the truth of the last 2 years, the parts that had happened while he was somewhere else living his reasonable life. And she watched his expression move through disbelief and then anger, and then something quieter and more complicated that she recognized as guilt. "You should have called me," he said. "I know. When it started, Alara, if I'd known." "I know." She wrapped her hands around the cup. But I'm not here about what I should have done. I'm here because if Foss comes to you, I need you to understand the context. I'll tell her the truth, he said, about who you were when I knew you, about what the relationship with Victor looked like from the beginning. That's all I'm asking. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you doing? He said. I mean, who's helping you? You didn't figure all this out alone. She held his gaze. Someone who should have minded his own business. Sam almost smiled. Okay, he said. Okay. She was back in Manhattan by noon. The call from her father came at 2. She heard it in his voice immediately. The thing that had been building towards something harder had reversed overnight, had gone soft and frightened again, and she felt the dread before he said a word. He came to the house, her father said. She sat down. Victor came to Boston. Last night, after 11. I didn't let him in, but a breath. He talked through the door for 20 minutes. What did he say? He said the permit issue was a misunderstanding that would be resolved if we could. Her father stopped, started again. He said you were confused, that you'd been under a great deal of stress and had formed attachments to people who didn't have your best interests at heart. He said there were things about another stop, longer. Dad. He said there were things about Roman Moretti that you didn't know, that Moretti had a history of involvement with vulnerable women, that he'd done this before, inserted himself into private situations and extracted what he wanted and left. Her father's voice was careful, pained, working around the shape of something he didn't entirely want to say. He had documentation, he said, things he was going to give to a journalist. The room held its silence. Elara sat in it for a long moment. She thought about what it would have taken, the specific calculation required, to drive to Boston and stand outside a 68-year-old man's house after 11 at night and talk through a closed door for 20 minutes. She thought about the patience that required, the controlled deliberateness of it, and she thought about how she'd always known Victor Grayson was patient, but she had never fully understood until now that his patience was not a virtue. It was a weapon. He's trying to separate you from your support, she said. She kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it even. He wants you afraid of Roman so that when he applies more pressure to the property, you'll call me and I'll have nowhere I trust. Her father was quiet. Whatever he said about Roman, she said, ask me directly. I'll tell you what I know. Is it true, her father said, that Moretti has done this before? That he... I don't know his full history, she said honestly. I know what he's done in the last 3 weeks. I know he found me in a corridor with a split lip and he didn't look away. That's what I know. Another long silence. Then, there's something else. Her chest tightened. What? He left an envelope under the door. Her father's voice was very quiet now. I didn't open it until this morning. I don't know how he got it. I don't know who... The photographs are from different events, different locations. You're in most of them. And there's a man I don't recognize in some. A pause. Elara, is someone watching you? She stood up very slowly. Send me the photographs, she said. The images arrived in 3 minutes. She opened them with hands that she deliberately steadied, one by one, standing in the middle of the apartment that was supposed to be secure, that Roman had arranged, that Clara had prepared with fresh towels and a stocked kitchen, and she moved through the photographs with a growing cold feeling in the pit of her stomach. The coffee shop in Brooklyn. Sam Cho across the table. The Kellerman offices. Her entering. This building. The lobby. Her getting into the elevator. The last photograph was dated 2 days ago, time-stamped 11:43 at night. It showed the window of this apartment, the 19th floor, the city light behind it. Someone had been outside this building with a camera at 11:43 at night. Victor didn't just know she was here. Victor had known since before she arrived. The cold in her stomach turned into something else, but not fear, or not only fear, but something brighter and more corrosive, because if he'd known all along where she was, then the last 3 days had not been Elara building distance and safety. The last 3 days had been Victor allowing her to believe she was building distance and safety. And the question that followed that understanding was immediate and merciless. What had he been building while she was busy believing she was safe? She called Roman. He answered in one ring. "Look at your phone," she said. "I'm sending you photographs." She heard him open them. She heard the silence. "How long have you had this building?" she said. 4 years? How many people know about it? Small number, trusted. One of them told Victor. She kept her voice flat and factual. She was working to keep it that way. Before I even arrived. He's had someone on the building since day one. He has photographs of Sam, of Kellerman, of this window. She stopped. He's been watching everything, the whole time. Roman's silence was different from his usual pauses. It had a texture she hadn't heard before. Not uncertainty, but something adjacent to it. The interval of a man recalibrating in real time. "Get away from the windows," he said. "Roman, step away from the windows and tell me you're doing it." She moved. She sat on the couch, away from the glass, and said, "Done. I'm coming to you." His voice was controlled. 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. Don't call anyone. Don't. "There's a leak," she said. "Somewhere in your operation, there's a leak. And if Victor has been watching this building since before I arrived, then he's been watching everything else too. And whatever you've been building against him, I know. He knows it too." "I know," Roman said. And in his voice, under the control, she heard something that she realized she'd never heard from him before. The specific quality of a man who has just understood that the board he thought he was playing on is not the board he's actually playing on, and that someone has been several moves ahead of him, and that the cost of that miscalculation was not yet fully visible. Roman arrived in 18 minutes. Alara heard the knock, 3 times measured the specific pattern he told her on the phone, and crossed the apartment and looked through the peephole before she opened the door. He came in without a word, and she stepped back and let him through, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at the photograph still open on her phone, and she watched his face work through something. He was controlled. He was always controlled. But there was a tightness in his jaw and a stillness in his eyes that she had learned to read now, and what she read in it was not calm. It was the specific expression of a man who has turned a situation over in his mind and found, in its underside, something he did not expect. "Sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down." He looked at her. "Alara, who knew about this building?" 4 people, he said, "including Clara. And you trust them?" "I trusted them." He put the word in the past tense with deliberate precision, and she heard the weight of it. "I'm already working it. Marcus knew." A beat. "Yes." "So Marcus could be—" "No." His voice was flat and certain. "Not Marcus." She looked at him. She held that certainty against everything else she knew, turned it over, tested it. She had been in this man's orbit for 3 weeks, and in that 3 weeks she had watched him make decisions without flinching, had watched him lay out information she needed to hear, even when it complicated his own position, had heard him say "not for you" in a utility corridor when the word consequences had made her body go cold with anticipation of pain. She made a decision. "Okay," she said. "Then who?" "I don't know yet." He set down the phone. "But the more important question right now is what Grayson does with what he has." "He has everything," she said. "He has my legal consultation. He has my location. He has Sam. He has the photograph of this building. What's left that he hasn't?" She stopped. Roman was watching her with that particular attention. "What?" she said. "He called the federal regulatory contact again this morning," Roman said. "Before I knew about the photographs. Before I knew the extent of it. He filed a formal inquiry with the SEC about several transactions connected to 2 of my companies." He held her gaze. "It's not a real case, that the transactions are clean, but an SEC inquiry takes time to resolve, and while it's open, it creates the appearance of impropriety, and that appearance is enough to complicate 3 contracts I'm currently closing." She understood immediately. "He's cutting your resources, tying you up legally so you can't, so I become a liability instead of an asset." He said it without self-pity, just clear, unvarnished fact. "He wants you to see that aligning with me costs more than it gains." "Does it?" He looked at her steadily. "That depends on what you decide." The afternoon light came through the gap in the curtains at a low angle, and in it she could see the lines of tiredness around his eyes and the specific set of his shoulders that had been carrying something heavy for a while. She thought about what it had cost him, the 3 weeks of involvement, the Marcus, the buildings, the investigators, the inquiry now sitting on his companies like a stone. She thought about a man who had looked at a woman gathering broken glass and decided it was his business. "He's going to move against my father next," she said. "The permit is the warning. The Boston visit was the warning. He's building toward something that forces me to choose between your protection and my father's safety." "Yes." "When?" "Soon. Days. Maybe less." She walked to the window, stopped herself, remembered, stepped back from the glass, and the automatic quality of that correction, the way she'd absorbed it as physical reflex in less than an hour, made something harden in her chest. "I'm not going back," she said. "I know. Whatever he does, I'm not going back." She turned to face him. "But I need my father out of his reach before it happens. And I need the debt documentation in front of a judge before he can call it." Roman nodded slowly. "Helen Chu filed this morning. Emergency motion for injunctive relief against any acceleration of the debt while the transfer dispute is under review." He paused. "Judge assigned is Carol Merritt. Is she clean?" He looked at her. "As far as I know." "As far as you know," she repeated. 3 weeks ago, that phrase would have been enough. Now I need better than that." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The specific look of a person watching someone else become a different, harder version of themselves in real time. "She's clean," he said. "I've looked at her for other matters. She's careful, and she doesn't owe anyone." "Then we need the injunction to hold," Ilara said, "and we need to get my father out of Boston before Victor decides the permit review wasn't enough. I can have people in Boston by tonight." "He won't come willingly," she said. "He's stubborn, and he's ashamed, and he'll think he can manage it." "Can you call him?" "I'll do better than call him." She looked around for her coat. "I'll go." Roman took a step toward her. "Ilara, he'll listen to me in person. He won't listen to a phone call." She found the coat on the chair by the door. "Book me on the next train. Your car will flag it if Victor's watching transportation. He'll expect your car. A train is less visible." Roman studied her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "When did you get like this?" he said. She pulled on the coat. "I've always been like this," she said. "I just spent 2 years forgetting." She was on an Amtrak out of Penn Station by 4:15 in a window seat with her coat pulled close and her phone in her lap, and the city giving way to the gray industrial corridor of New Jersey outside the glass. Marcus had arranged the ticket in a name that was not her name, which was the kind of thing she'd never imagined needing and now accepted without ceremony. Roman had put 2 of his people on the train 3 cars back, which she also accepted. She called her father at 4:32 and told him she was coming and told him not to tell anyone, and heard in his voice the same exhausted relief of a person who has been standing in the dark long enough to accept whatever light arrives. The train took 4 hours. She spent most of them thinking. She thought about the source inside Kellerman, which was still unidentified, and she thought about what documents the source had passed to Victor, and she thought about how much of her consultation with Helen Chu was now sitting in Victor Grayson's hands, and she thought about whether there was anything in what she'd said that he could use against her in the specific way he'd always been best at. Not the law, but the social machinery, the reputation, the narrative. Victor Grayson's real weapon had never been money. It had been story. He was very good at being the story's author. She arrived in Boston at 8:43. Her father met her at the door, and she saw immediately that he'd aged in ways she hadn't registered over the phone. He was 68 and had always carried it well. But standing in the doorway of the family house in the Beacon Hill neighborhood that was now mostly memory, the furniture she'd grown up with, the carpets worn thin in the same places she'd worn them as a child, he looked like a man who had been making himself smaller for a long time and had only just begun to understand why. She hugged him. He held on longer than she expected. They sat in the kitchen, which was the room that had always been the real room of the house, the one where actual conversations happened. She told him everything this time. Not the managed version, not the what he needs to know version. Everything. The Whitmore corridor, the wrist, the 2 years of incident by incident, and the cumulative arithmetic of it, and the legal picture as it now stood, and the injunction, and the SEC inquiry against Roman, and the source inside Kellerman. Her father listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he sat for a long moment with both hands flat on the table, a gesture she recognized because she'd seen Roman do it in a different kitchen on a different morning, and the parallel landed somewhere wordless in her chest. "I'm going to ask you something," her father said, "and I want you to hear the question without the weight of everything that's happened." "Okay." "This man, Moretti." He looked at her steadily. "What is he to you?" She held the question. She turned it over with the same careful attention she'd been giving everything in the last 3 weeks. Because it deserved careful attention, and because she had learned, somewhat brutally, the cost of not paying it. "Someone who looked at the right thing at the right time," she said. Her father nodded slowly. "And you trust him?" "More than I've trusted anyone in 2 years," she said, which I know isn't a high bar. Something in her father's face eased. Not resolved. There was too much for it to resolve, but eased. The specific relaxation of a man who has been holding a question for a long time and has just received enough of an answer to set it down. "I'll come back with you," he said. She exhaled. "You don't have to. I'm not staying here while my daughter is—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I'm coming back with you," he said again. "That's what I'm doing." They left the next morning on the first train. Victor moved that afternoon. She found out at 2:15 when Roman called her on the train, his voice carrying the sharp clarity of someone who has just received information and is already 3 steps into its implications. "He took Kellerman's source," Roman said. "Whoever was inside, they're gone. The firm identified them this morning. A junior paralegal named Brett Cannon, employed 18 months. He cleaned out his desk last night." A pause. "He took copies of your complete client file." Alara gripped the phone. "Which means Victor has everything," she said. "He has the incident dates, the documentation you gave Helen, the witness names you wrote down." She thought about the 3 names she'd written on Helen Chu's notepad. She thought about each of those people being contacted by Victor, or by Victor's people, being pressured or frightened or offered something. "He'll go after the witnesses," she said. "Already happening. One of them, the woman from the Harwick event, Diana Reese, she called Helen this morning and withdrew her willingness to provide a statement. One of 3. The others? Still reachable, but scared." She looked out the train window at the Connecticut landscape moving past. Her father was in the seat beside her with his eyes closed, which was either sleep or the dignified performance of sleep to give her privacy, and she loved him for it either way. "What does he do next?" she said. "If he has the file and he has the witnesses scared and the SEC inquiry is open and Cannon is gone, what does he do next?" Roman was quiet for a moment. "He brings you back," he said. "That's what everything has been building toward. Not punishing you, not destroying the legal case. He wants you back because that's the only resolution that puts him back in the author's seat. Everything else is leverage to make that happen. He can't force me to—" "He'll go through your father." Roman's voice was careful. "The injunction is holding for now. But if Merritt gets pressure from somewhere, a call, a recommendation, the right influence applied at the right level, the injunction gets stayed, the debt acceleration goes through, and your father loses the Beacon Street property in 60 days. She sat with this, her father in the seat beside her with his eyes closed. 60 days. "What do you need?" she said. "I need 2 things," Roman said. "I need Helen Chu to get a deposition from the second witness before Victor's people reach them. And I need the original debt transfer documents, the physical records from the transaction 3 years ago. If I can get those in front of Merritt, the injunction becomes permanent and the acceleration is moot." "Where are those documents, Holm?" A pause. "Grayson Capital Partners. Physical records. Archived. Floor 31 of the Grayson building." She almost laughed. "You're telling me the documents I need to free my father from Victor's control are sitting in Victor's building?" "There's a compliance officer named Thomas Weil," Roman said. "He's been with the firm 12 years. He's the one who processed the original transfer. He's also been cooperating with a quiet SEC inquiry, a separate one, real one, predating my situation, for the last 8 months. He's already outside the wire. He just needs a reason to take the last step. What kind of reason? Someone he trusts asking him directly, face to face. She understood. He'll recognize me. He'll recognize that you have something to lose, which means he'll know you're not a setup. She looked out the window. Gray sky, moving trees, the ordinary world. When? She said. Tonight. Before Victor realizes the inquiry is connecting to him and pulls Weil out of reach. That's... She stopped. Started. Roman, Victor is watching every building I enter. He has photographs. He has... I know. A pause. Which is why you don't go in as Alara Vale. The train arrived in New York at 3:47. Marcus was waiting outside Penn Station with a car and an expression of professional neutrality and a bag in the back seat that contained, among other things, a visitor badge for the Grayson building under the name Sarah Chen, attached to a legitimate appointment with the building's event space coordinator that Marcus had booked through a third-party event planning company 48 hours ago. She stared at it. It's clean, Marcus said. The appointment is real. You walk in, you take the elevator to 30, you walk up one flight to 31, you find Weil. You have 10 minutes maximum. And if Victor is in the building? He's in a board meeting on 47. I have eyes on the lobby. You'll know before you walk in. She looked at her father, who was standing on the sidewalk with his single bag and the expression of a man who has committed to a thing. Go with Marcus, she told him. Don't argue. He looked at her. Please, she said. He went with Marcus. She changed in the back of a second car that Roman had arranged, which was a practical and deeply strange experience. Stripping off the clothes she'd traveled in and pulling on a dark blazer and glasses and her hair in a shape that was not her usual shape, which was not a disguise exactly, but an alteration of silhouette, the way magicians talk about misdirection. She was not trying to be invisible. She was trying to be forgettable. Roman was already at the building when she arrived. Not inside, outside, across the street, in a parked car that she did not look at as she walked past because looking at it was the kind of thing that drew attention. She knew he was there because he'd said, before she got out of the car, I'll be across the street, the whole time. She walked through the lobby of the Grayson building on a Tuesday at 4:20 in the afternoon, and the security desk checked her visitor badge against the appointment record and printed her a badge and sent her to elevator bank B. And the whole thing took 90 seconds, and her heartbeat was loud in her ears the whole time. 31st floor. Compliance and records. She found Thomas Weil's office at the end of a corridor lined with the kind of neutral corporate art that existed to fill space rather than mean anything. His door was open. He was a compact man in his early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the specific look of someone who had been sitting with a difficult decision for so long that the difficulty had become ambient. He looked up when she appeared in his doorway. He recognized her. She watched it happen, the slight widening, the recalibration. His hand moved toward his desk phone. Don't, she said quietly. Please. I'm not here on his behalf. I'm here because I need your help, and I think you already know why. His hand stopped. She stepped inside the office and pulled the door closed behind her. The original transfer documentation, she said. The debt vehicle. You processed it 3 years ago. You know what it was? He looked at her for a long time. His hands were on the desk, not moving, the same quality of stillness she'd seen in her father's hands, in Roman's hands, in her own hands, in the mirror in the last week. The specific stillness of people who are making decisions that cannot be unmade. There's an inquiry, she said. You've been cooperating with it for 8 months. I'm not connected to that inquiry, and I'm not asking you to do anything that crosses whatever line you've already drawn. She stepped forward. I'm asking you for the transfer records, the original documents, that's all. Give them to me, and Helen Chu at Kellerman files them tonight, and the injunction becomes permanent, and my father keeps his building, and Victor Grayson loses the one lever he has to bring me back. Weil's jaw moved. They'll know it was me, he said. They'll know it was someone, she said. But by the time they do, the documents will be in front of a federal judge, and you'll be 3 steps further into a cooperation agreement that protects you. She held his gaze. Or you leave them in that drawer, and in 6 months you're facing whatever the inquiry finds without the goodwill that comes from this. He looked at the drawer. She stood very still. Somewhere above them on the 47th floor, in a board meeting that Marcus's eyes were tracking in real time, Victor Grayson was sitting in a chair that faced a window that looked out at the same city she was standing in, and she thought about that. The vertical geography of it. The two of them in the same building, separated by 16 floors and 2 years, and everything that had happened in both. Weil opened the drawer. He took out a manila folder. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man saying goodbye to the version of himself that had kept it there. He held it out to her. She took it. She was in the elevator heading back down when her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. He's leaving the board meeting early. Her stomach dropped. She hit lobby. The elevator descended. She watched the floor numbers and breathed and thought, 10 floors, 8, 6. The elevator was slow, the particular slowness of a mechanism that has no concept of stakes, that moves at the same pace regardless of everything. The lobby opened in front of her. She walked, not ran, walked, because running was the thing that made security guards look up, toward the exit, through the revolving door and into the cold air of the street, and she turned right without looking across at Roman's car and walked half a block, and her phone buzzed again. He's in elevator bank A, heading down. She walked faster. She was at the corner when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the air, the specific quality of a large space discharging people. And she knew without turning that the lobby doors behind her had opened, and she kept walking, kept her eyes forward, kept her breathing even, and her phone buzzed a third time, and this time it was Roman's voice. Not a text, but a call, and she answered it without breaking stride. "Don't stop," he said. "Keep walking. Turn left at the next corner." "He's out of the building. He's on the sidewalk. He's not looking your way. Keep walking." She turned left. "Good," Roman said. Keep going." "Did he see me?" A pause that lasted approximately 1 year. "I don't know," Roman said. She walked. The folder was in her bag against her ribs, and she could feel it there with every step, the physical weight of documents that were about to change the shape of everything. And behind her, the street contained Victor Grayson, or didn't, and she walked and did not look back and did not stop. And the city moved around her in its complete indifference, and Roman's voice said, "Keep going," and she turned 2 more corners before Roman said, "Car, 20 feet, gray sedan." She saw it, she reached it, she got in. The door closed and the car moved, and she sat in the back seat with the folder pressed against her ribs through the bag, and her breathing loud in her own ears. And she looked out the rear window once, one time only. And the street behind her held ordinary traffic and ordinary people, and no sign of Victor Grayson. She turned back around. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were a separate and somewhat unreliable instrument, and then she pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there until they steadied. "He didn't follow," Marcus said from the front seat. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she exhaled. Slow, controlled, the way you breathe when you're teaching your body that the emergency is over, even when you're not entirely certain the emergency is over. She opened the bag. She looked at the folder. She thought about Thomas Weil in his office on the 31st floor, sitting now with an open drawer and a decision he couldn't take back. And she thought about what it cost a person to do the right thing after spending a long time not doing it. And she thought, I know exactly what that costs. She called Helen Chu. Helen answered on the second ring, and Alara said, I have the transfer documents, original records. I need you to file tonight. A pause. Then Helen Chu, who had 20 years of family law and a voice calibrated for delivering difficult news, said something Alara had not heard from a professional in this entire ordeal. Good girl. It was a strange thing to say. It was also, in that moment, exactly right. Helen filed at 7:49 that evening. Judge Merritt received the emergency supplement to the injunction at 8:15, reviewed it in her chambers with the focused efficiency of a jurist who had not gotten where she was by being slow, and by 9:03 she had signed an order making the injunction permanent pending full resolution of the debt transfer dispute. Victor Grayson received notification through his attorneys at 9:17. Roman told Alara at 9:22. She was sitting in the kitchen of another of his properties, a brownstone in the West Village this time, smaller and older and feeling, somehow, more like a place where actual people lived, with her father across the table and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been operating on adrenaline for 4 days and has just felt the adrenaline leave. "It's done," she said. "The injunction is permanent. The debt acceleration is blocked until the transfer dispute resolves, which, with the original documentation, is not going to resolve in Grayson's favor." He paused. "Your father's building is safe." Her father made a sound across the table. Not words, something older than words. She reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held on. "What about Victor?" she said. "That's a longer answer," Roman said. "Tonight you should sleep." "Roman?" "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll come tomorrow morning." She let him go. She looked at her father's hand under hers, the familiar geography of it, the knuckles she'd known her whole life. She thought about all the conversations they hadn't had in 2 years, all the things she'd managed away from him to protect him from the weight of her own choices and mistakes, and she thought about how protection, applied wrong, could look identical to isolation. "Dad?" she said. He looked up. "I should have told you sooner," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have asked sooner." He turned her hand over, the way he used to when she was small and had hurt herself, the examining gesture of a parent checking for damage. "We both have things to answer for." "Not equally," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not equally." He looked at her hand, but enough to be honest about. She slept for 10 hours. She didn't know she was capable of it anymore. When she woke, the light in the room was late morning, and her body felt like something that had been wrung out and left to dry, deeply tired in a way that was also underneath, something like relief. The exhaustion of a structure that has been under impossible load and has been, at last, allowed to rest. Roman came at 10. He sat across from her at the brownstone kitchen table. Her father had gone to take a call with his own attorney, who Helen Chu had recommended, and the kitchen was theirs. And he laid out what the next weeks looked like with the same direct, ungarnished clarity she had come to expect from him, and she listened and asked questions and took the shape of it in. Victor's legal team had filed 2 responses overnight. Both were procedural, delay tactics, the reflexes of expensive attorneys buying time. Neither would hold. The debt transfer documentation was clean and damning, and Judge Merritt, Roman said, was not a judge who appreciated her time being wasted. The SEC inquiry against Roman's companies had been submitted with supporting documentation from an anonymous source, which Marcus had traced to a shell entity connected to a Grayson Capital vendor. The SEC's own investigators, when shown the chain, had redirected their inquiry accordingly. Roman's companies were clean. The inquiry would close. Thomas Weil had retained an attorney and was in active cooperation discussions with 2 separate regulatory bodies. He had not been contacted by Grayson's people since the previous evening, which suggested Victor was already managing a containment problem of his own. Brett Cannon, the Kellerman paralegal, had been located in New Jersey. He'd retained an attorney as well. The attorney had reached out to Helen Chu. This, Roman explained, was how it went when people understood that the side they'd chosen was the losing side. They started looking for the door. Alara listened to all of it and thought about the machinery of it, how many people had moved and been moved, how many small decisions had accumulated into this morning and this table and this cup of coffee that was still hot. "The witnesses," she said. Diana Reese withdrew. "Yes." "The other 2? "Both still willing. With Weil's cooperation and the documentation, they're supporting evidence, not load-bearing." He looked at her steadily. "You don't need Diana Reese." She nodded. She thought about Diana Reese, who had been afraid, who had made the choice fear makes, and she found she couldn't hold it against her in any clean way. Fear made a lot of choices that looked like cowardice from the outside. She knew this personally. "What about Foss?" she said. The journalist. Roman's expression shifted, something careful moving across it. Foss reached out to my communications attorney yesterday morning. She's pivoting the story. Alara looked at him. Pivoting how? From a story about my business interests to a story about financial coercion in private equity arrangements. She has the debt transfer documents now. Helen filed them publicly. She has Weil as a source. She has Sam Cho's account of your relationship's timeline. He paused. She has a better story than the one Grayson gave her. The specific cold irony of this settled over Alara slowly. Victor had gone to Diane Foss to weaponize the press against Roman. Instead, he had handed a veteran investigative journalist the documented story of his own financial manipulation of a family, a fraudulent debt structure, a pattern of coercive engagement, and the paralegal he'd corrupted inside a law firm. He built the weapon himself, she said. He usually does, Roman said. That's what happens when someone's been the author for long enough. They forget that other people can write. She looked at him across the table. He had his hands around his coffee cup, and there were lines around his eyes that she'd been watching accumulate over the past 3 weeks. The specific marking of a person who has been running hard in a direction that cost him something. And she thought about what she'd asked herself in the borrowed apartment on the 19th floor. What is he to you? She had an answer now that was more specific than the one she'd given her father. The SEC thing, she said. Your company's. Even closed. It's going to follow you. For a while. I'm sorry. He looked at her. Don't. Roman, don't apologize for that. His voice was even, but there was something in it, direct and clear. That's not yours. She held his gaze. She thought about the utility corridor at the Whitmore dinner, and the card. And I'm sorry I broke the glass. And the long, patient work of 2 years of learning to apologize for things that were not hers. She thought about how the habit had settled into her so deep that she could feel it even now. The reflexive reach for accountability that wasn't accountability at all, but something else. The survival strategy of a person who had learned that accepting blame was faster than arguing about it. All right, she said. Then thank you. Roman looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was different from the controlled expression she'd grown used to. Quieter, less armored, the face of a man who had not expected this particular morning to feel the way it felt. You did the work, he said. I opened a door. You stood outside it for 3 weeks and kept it from being kicked in, she said. He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. She wasn't sure she'd seen a full one yet. But the edge of it, the place where it started, was enough. The full weight of what came next arrived over the following weeks in increments rather than all at once, which was, Alara understood afterward, the merciful way. Foss's story ran 18 days after the morning in the brownstone kitchen. It ran in a national outlet with a long and deeply reported account of the debt transfer scheme, the Kellerman breach, and a pattern of financial coercion that Weil's cooperation had illuminated in considerable detail. Victor Grayson's name was in the headline. His photograph was in the 3rd paragraph. His attorney issued a statement calling the reporting inaccurate, defamatory, and politically motivated, which was the statement his attorney had prepared to issue regardless of what the story said. 2 of the investors in the fraudulent debt vehicle retained their own attorneys within 48 hours of publication. The 3rd issued a public statement expressing concern and calling for transparency. The SEC inquiry, redirected, became an investigation. This one was real. Victor's board seats became uncomfortable and then untenable. He resigned from the healthcare conglomerate's board on a Tuesday, which was reported as voluntary. He resigned from the First Bank's board on a Thursday, which was also reported as voluntary, and which the bank's communications team described as allowing him to focus on addressing ongoing regulatory concerns, which was a sentence no one believed. He called Alara once. She was at her father's house in Boston. She'd gone back to help him with the property paperwork, and had stayed a few days because the house felt different now. Not healed exactly, but in the process of it, the specific atmosphere of a place that has had something lifted from it. And his name appeared on her screen, and she sat with it for the 4 rings it took to go to voicemail, and then she listened to the message. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. What he said was careful and precise and entirely characteristic, that there had been misunderstandings, that the legal situation was being resolved, that he hoped she understood there had never been any intent to cause harm, and that he remained open to a conversation if she was ready. She deleted the message. She did not call back. She thought about it later. Not the call, but the fact of deleting it, the specific muscular decision of pressing that button, and the absence of ambivalence in it. 2 years ago, she would have called back. 2 years ago, she would have heard misunderstandings and felt the familiar pull of doubt. The question of whether she'd misread things, overreacted, made the situation worse than it was. She would have sat with the message for days, turning it over, finding the version of it that maybe meant something else. She pressed delete and made dinner and sat with her father and watched an old film they'd both seen before. And she felt, underneath the fatigue and the unresolved complexity and the things that still needed doing, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd stopped knowing its name. She felt like herself. Victor Grayson's empire did not collapse overnight. That was not how these things worked, and Alara, who had spent 3 weeks learning the architecture of power and its failure modes, understood that. It came apart in pieces. The way things built on false foundations come apart. A crack, then another, then the slow recognition in the people around it that the structure was not sound, and that proximity to it was becoming a liability rather than an asset. His longtime CFO resigned in the 6th week. His flagship fund lost 2 anchor investors in the 7th. By the 8th week, when the SEC issued its first formal subpoena, the social invitations had quietly stopped, which was the city's true verdict. Not the law, not the press, but the simple withdrawal of the world's willingness to pretend. Alara was not watching, not closely. She got the updates from Helen Chu and from Roman, and from the news she occasionally read, and she registered them the way you register weather reports from a city you no longer live in, noted, relevant to a version of things that no longer applied to her present geography. She had other things to build. She found an apartment in the West 20s, the kind of place that required her own money rather than anyone else's, which meant it was smaller than she'd lived in for years and entirely hers. She painted the kitchen herself over a long weekend, which was a thing she had not done since she was 22, and living with 2 roommates and believing the future was enormous and navigable, and the specific physical pleasure of it, the smell, the ache in her arms, the color appearing under her brush, was so uncomplicated and so immediately satisfying that she stood back at the end of the 2nd day and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't been able to reach in years. She took a position at a nonprofit that worked with the Harbor Legal Aid Society, doing intake coordination. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of work that appeared in the society pages she'd spent 2 years decorating. It was work that required her to sit across from people who were frightened and in over their heads and had run out of the options they'd thought they had, and to help them find the ones that remained. She was good at it. She and Roman did not have an easy relationship. She had not expected them to. Easy was not the word for what had grown between 2 people who had met in a corridor with broken glass and blood and the specific tension of a world about to rearrange itself. What they had was something more complicated and more durable than easy. Honesty, and the kind of trust that can only come from having watched someone make a hard choice under actual pressure. He took her to dinner 3 weeks after the brownstone kitchen morning. Not as a gesture, not as a transaction, as a question, posed through the act of asking, and she answered it by showing up in a dress that she had chosen herself, for reasons of her own, and they sat across from each other in a place that was neither glamorous nor generic, and talked for 3 hours about things that were not the last month, and she discovered, which she had suspected, that he was a man who read broadly and thought carefully, and had spent a long time being known only for the parts of himself that were useful to other people's fear of him. She understood something about that personally. They went slowly. They went carefully. They argued twice in the first month. Once about a decision he made without consulting her that affected her directly, and once about something smaller that was actually about the same thing. And both times she said the true version of what she thought without routing it through the managed version. And both times he heard it and adjusted, and neither of them required the other to pretend the disagreement hadn't happened. This was new. This was very new. She was still learning the shape of it. Her father came to New York in the fall and met Roman properly, not in the chaos of the brownstone, but in the ordinary way. Dinner, conversation, the unremarkable social ritual of 2 people deciding whether they could occupy the same world. Her father was careful and watchful in the way of a man who understood his own prior failures of observation and was working to correct them. Roman was direct and did not perform anything which her father, she thought, respected. Afterward, walking back to his hotel, her father said, "He looks at you like you're a person." She almost laughed. "That's a low bar, Dad." "I know," he said. "I know what bar I set." She linked her arm through his. They walked. "He's good," she said, "in the ways that count." Her father nodded. He did not push further, which was its own kind of growth. The night that settled into her memory as the one that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else happened in early winter, 7 months after the crystal glass shattered on the marble floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel. The Whitmore Foundation Dinner, 14th Annual, benefits Children's Hospital Network of the Northeast. She had been invited in her own right this time. Helen Chu sat on the foundation's advisory board, had recommended her to the organizing committee, and her name appeared on the invitation as Alara Vale, intake coordinator, Harbor Legal Aid Society, with no other person's name attached to it. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror and put on the dress she'd chosen, not green, not borrowed, and looked at herself for a long moment. She looked tired in a way that was not distress, the ordinary tiredness of a person who is working hard at something real. She looked like someone who had been through a thing. She was not trying to hide that. Roman met her outside the hotel at 7:45. He had not worn a tie. She had told him she preferred him without one, and he had simply not worn one, which was a small thing that was not small. They went in together. The ballroom was the same, chandeliers, orchestra, 500 conversations, crystal glasses catching light from every direction. She stood in the entrance for a moment and felt the full weight of recognition. This room, this sound, this smell, the muscle memory of 2 years of performing herself for an audience that included one person she needed to please and feared to displease. Roman stood beside her, not holding her arm, not guiding her, just beside her. She breathed in, she breathed out, she walked in. It was 2 hours into the evening, during the cocktail reception that preceded the dinner, that a server moved through the crowd with a tray and caught the edge of a table, and a glass tipped and fell and shattered on the marble floor with a crack that cut through the ambient noise of the room and sent a ripple of turned heads through the nearby crowd. Alara froze. Not for long. Half a second, maybe less. A flinch response, involuntary, the body's faster memory overriding the mind's. She stood with her breath caught, and the sound still ringing in the air and the familiar cold feeling moving through her, and then she let it go. She felt it move through her and out the other side, and she was still standing, and the room was still the room, and the server was apologizing to a nearby guest, and the broken glass was just broken glass. She exhaled. Roman had turned toward her, quiet, watchful, not performing concern, just present. "I'm all right," she said. He nodded. He did not say good or I know or anything that would have made her feeling his to manage. He just nodded, and she understood from that nod that he was the kind of person who knew the difference between someone needing to be held up and someone choosing to stand on their own, and who would not confuse the two. She looked at the broken glass on the floor. A server was already there with a cloth and a pan, swift and efficient. She thought about the night she had knelt to gather fragments just like these. She thought about the blood on her hands, and the apologies she had said to the floor, and the 20 feet of marble she had walked back across to Victor Grayson's side. She thought about how small she had made herself to survive in that room, and how she had carried the smallness for so long that she had forgotten it was not her actual size. She thought about everything that had happened between that floor and this one. She did not reach down. She did not apologize. She did not perform anything for anyone. She stood in the room in her own dress with her own name and felt the floor under her feet, solid and real and simply there, the way floors are supposed to be. And she understood something she had been circling for months without landing on, that survival was not the thing she should have been grateful for all along. Survival was the floor. The floor was just where you stood. What mattered was what you did with the standing. Roman's hand found hers, not urgently, not with the weight of a statement, just the warmth of a hand against hers in a cold room, unhurried, asking nothing. And she looked at him, and he looked at her with that particular quality of attention he had always given her, complete, patient, seeing the actual thing rather than the version of it she'd arranged for the world to see. "Ready?" he said. The room moved around them. Somewhere across the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore was beginning the remarks that preceded dinner. Somewhere a glass was being refilled, a hand was being shaken, a story was being told about someone to someone else. The 1,000 small acts of social continuation that kept a room like this moving. She thought about Helen Chu and her father, and Sam Cho in his Brooklyn studio, and Thomas Weil, and even Diana Reese, who had been afraid, and Brett Cannon, who had made the wrong choice and was now living with it. And she thought about all the people who had been in this story without knowing they were in a story, just making their decisions in the same dim, ordinary way that people make decisions, with the information they had, in the direction of what they feared or wanted, trying to get to the next day. She thought about a version of herself kneeling on a marble floor, apologizing to glass. She thought, she is not gone. She is not separate, not a smaller person who lived in the past. She is still here, still in this body, still in this room. She had not survived her. She had become her, had brought her forward, had made her into whatever Alara Vale was now standing at the edge of the Whitmore Foundation dinner, in her own dress, with her own name. She looked at Roman. "Ready?" she said. The music shifted. The crowd settled. Somewhere a glass was raised in a toast, and it did not shatter, and the sound of it was just the ordinary sound of crystal and light, and people choosing to be in the same room together. And Alara Vale held a man's hand and walked forward into the middle of it. She did not apologize. She did not make herself small. She walked in like someone who had paid for the floor beneath her with something real, and she stood on it. And she was still standing when the evening ended and the guests filed out, and the city continued its long and indifferent life outside the glass, and the woman who had once knelt to gather broken glass and called it her fault found that she had, somewhere in the last 7 months and 3 weeks, and all the terrible ordinary courage required of them, stopped waiting for permission to take up exactly as much space as she was owed. The chandeliers held their light, the city held its noise. She held on, and was held, and that was enough. And then it was more than enough. And then it was simply what her life was. The end. This is a fictional work created solely for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, events, and details are entirely fictional and bear no relation to any real person, organization, or historical event.